And yeah, Mr. Robbie Yeager, welcome back to the stream.
Hey guys, thanks for having me back on. Such short notice, I know, but I really appreciate you guys having me on to talk about this because you're right. Nobody has. I mean, not really anybody has talked about it at all.
Yeah.
Maybe outside of local stations down here.
It's crazy. And for anyone that's listening that might not be fully aware, we're going to be talking about an oil spill, but there's also a big oil spill that's getting a lot of news right now that's actually going on in the San Francisco area. Would you mind just, before we get into the North Carolina pipeline, setting up what's going on with that and why you think it's getting so much more media attention than the story you've been reporting on?
Sure. So, I mean, that discussion actually could take a while if we were to choose to really dive deep into the nuance of it. But basically, for those that haven't seen the footage, and I think that's partly why this has gone viral the way it has. But in San Francisco Bay, there's a Chevron facility that had a leak in one of its tanks, and it wound up spilling 600 gallons of oil into the bay. Right, and there's helicopter footage. Right, it looks terrible. You know what I'm saying? You can just see the massive amount of oil, and it looks so massive and so dangerous, so deadly. But it was 600 gallons, right? So what I propose is that, as terrible as that is, and that is terrible, obviously, right? Which is
1.2 million.
Yeah, but I said if this how bad this looks, just imagine how terrible 1.2 million gallons would look instead of that just being 600, right? As to why it's getting more coverage, I do think that the footage always helps when you have that just shocking footage of just the amount of oil floating in that water. It definitely helps. And of course it's in California. I mean, let's just be for real. I mean, when things like
not
this
just
happen,
California, the San Francisco Bay, right? Probably one of the most affluent areas per capita per square mile, at least outside of Manhattan. You know what I mean?
And in the community that facility is, the Chevron facility, I think the community's name is Richmond. That facility is like the number one employer in that community, right? So it's going to make headlines locally, but just being in San Francisco, being in the Bay, and with the combination of all of that, and like I said, it's California. Things tend to happen elsewhere in the country that may go completely ignored, but when it happens at the footsteps of California or New York, now suddenly a lot of people start to pay attention.
I remember when the COVID was first breaking out, it was like people were just focusing on New York City with Cuomo and de Blasio as if the rest of the country didn't exist, because that's where all the media was out of. They're all in New York.
It's lazy journalism, right? They don't want to actually have to go outside of where they live and where they regularly congregate, right? So we hear a lot about what's going on in New York, LA, Seattle, right? Nothing about flyover country or, the South. Is North Carolina considered the South? Do you guys consider yourself the South?
We consider ourselves the South. I believe we still are considered the South, right?
Oh, yeah. 100%.
For sure. I've never been to North Carolina. I've only been to South Carolina. So that's why I asked.
Well, South Carolina is definitely the South.
That's definitely the South.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So, that's for sure. Now, North Carolina, over the years, has actually gone through a large transformation as far as population density. There's been lots of transplants, a lot of people moving down to here from parts north. So really, it's North Carolina politics is actually one of the most complicated subjects because we always vote blue or something for governor, but we vote red for president. We send Republican senators into Congress. It's a mess. We're really a purple state, but if you looked at the last two electoral college maps, you would just say, hey man, these guys are a red state. They're part of the South, just like
what was that one?
South Carolina. What
was that guy's name that tried to get in the Senate? Like Cal Cunningham or something?
Cal Cunningham.
He ended up being like an adulterer and didn't quite win the election despite the Democrats.
Something about North Carolina Democratic politicians and having marital issues is I don't know if you guys remember John Edwards, who
John Edwards.
He was supposed to be the golden boy, and then
Terry Edwards, 2004.
Yeah, and that dude did some heinous shit. To his dying wife, right? Way to go. Like I said, North Carolina, man, I'm telling you.
Got great. One of the few respectable states with barbecue outside of Kansas City. So
I mean, hey, at least we got something good going for us, right? But in all seriousness, and this kind of segues into the story that I've been covering. So the 1.2 million gallon gasoline leak it happened just outside of Charlotte in North Carolina. Charlotte's the biggest city in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So you would think that and local news has been covering, and as a matter of fact, I've been kind of working behind the scenes with a couple of local newscasters, local journalists, trying to just kind of help. We're all just kind of sharing notes, right? Trying to find out more about what's going on. But see, there is no fancy flyover footage, for that leak. There is no, devastating like drinking water catastrophe, and that's a good thing, right? So, the EPA found that there was no drinking water contamination to this. But the only problem is that there definitely was contamination, and I'll try to circle back around to that if I have time. But the long and short of this, basically, is whenever it first happened, and this has a lot to do with why it wasn't covered, is Colonial Pipeline reported it only being 60,000 gallons estimated that have leaked, right? And then a couple of months later, and that was in August of 2020, November rolls around, and they're requested to reevaluate, and they come out, okay, so it's probably closer to like 270 some thousand gallons. So then the local regulators in North Carolina, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, they start noticing in reports that Colonial Pipeline is already saying that they've recovered close to 250 gallons or 250,000 gallons. There's no way that reclaim rate is going to be so high. There's got to be more out there. So they tell Colonial to revise their estimates one more time. And they come back finally in January. And they said that it was actually 1.2 million gallons of gasoline that leaked into the ground. And
so with the other estimates, that fucking lies, essentially?
Well, and that's the thing. That's
a big difference, right? That's a big jump.
And this is what brought me into the story, right? Sure. So I didn't find that myself. That came across my timeline. I saw it and I was like, wow, that's a huge discrepancy.
Yeah.
Like, so who's doing your math? That's what I wanted to know.
Yeah.
That's terrible. Right. So
you got Jeff Bezos' accountant doing your fucking math there.
Right. It's criminal. Like that, just being so bad at that estimate. That's terrible. So, I started digging through some paperwork filed with the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is a branch of the United States Department of Transportation. They handle all pipeline regulations and stuff like that. So I was looking through their inspection records for the Colonial Pipeline. And what I found was that in 2019, they inspected a maximum of 45% of their pipeline. So the way that, and I think you're showing it on screen right now, the screenshot on there is from the report. So the way they count miles is that they don't actually tell you what stretches of miles they checked. They don't tell you if these miles are unique. So as the top where it says,
so they can only check the good parts, right?
Right. Well, I mean, the thing is like where it says, corrosion or metal loss tools, it was checked 909.01 miles. But then right below it, it says dent or deformation tools, also 909.01 miles. Common sense would lead you to believe that that's the same stretch of 909 miles being checked by the same tool that does two different things, right? But yet they still count that as part of their total miles inspected. So these numbers that they're reporting are on the high end and highly misleading. That's number one. And number two, the leak itself came from a crack, right? It came from a crack in the pipeline. So 2019, they only checked 649 miles of the pipeline with crack detection tools. And as bad as that is, looking at the report that I wrote, I went back further to 2018, and they only checked 150 miles of the pipeline in 2018 looking for cracks. So my first reaction is it's kind of hard to stop 1.2 million gallon gasoline leaks through a crack in your pipeline if you're not checking it for cracks.
Yeah.
Right?
And this information was all public, right? Like it's not like someone handed you a flash drive with this shit on it.
Right. No, I mean, you kind of have to figure out where you're supposed to look, right?
Yeah.
And trust me, that website in particular does not make it easy for you to kind of navigate.
Yeah. I was almost
picturing dated.
I was almost picturing like Ralph Nader, going over that with like a highlighter, trying to find out where the regulation wasn't up to snuff. Right. And it's so obvious. I mean, it's so fucking blatant. You can, if you were able to find it, then that just means they weren't even really hiding it that much.
Well, yeah, and because there's nothing to hide, and that it kind of winds up being, a double-edged problem here. Colonial Pipeline since 2004 hasn't checked more than 30% of their pipeline in any given year with any one detection method, right? So doesn't matter, and I hope that makes sense, right? So
yeah,
there's a whole. They haven't used any one tool in any 1 year on more than 30% of their
Yeah, so they've never gone end to end to check it out the whole thing.
never. No,
exactly. Why would they not, right? Unless they were hiding something.
And it's funny because regulation says that they only have to check it once every 5 years. But if you're only checking 10% of your pipeline for cracks every 5 years, then you've only checked 50% by the time the 5 years is up. If you're on a rolling basis, and Colonial is very happy to tell you that they comply with the every 5-year regulation, and that's basically them passing the buck from their shittiness, right? They're passing that buck up the road to the regulators and saying, hey, this is all they require of us. And until they say otherwise, we're not going to do any different. In the last 20 years, there have been 2,751 pipeline spills in the United States. Colonial Pipeline accounts for 272 of those. In North Carolina, in that same time span, there has been 38 pipeline spills, and 32 of those, again, come from the Colonial Pipeline. That's at a clip of one incident every 8 months. Okay, they're having accidents at a greater rate than your average forklift operator. Okay, this pipeline costs multiple billions of dollars to build, and they made $1 billion.
Well, they have to make a shit ton of money if 1.2 million gallons is inconsequential loss, right?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, look, and that's what I'm saying. The EPA, I contacted the EPA, and I asked them, because Colonial's own report that they had a third party do for them basically said, like, yeah, there is lots of groundwater contamination. There is stuff in the groundwater that are at levels high enough to violate the Groundwater Safety Act in the area. But the EPA also said that when they were responding to my question was whether or not they were going to be further investigating the Colonial Pipeline spill or the aftermath. They said, well, there wasn't any drinking water contamination and there wasn't any air quality contamination.
So that's the new standard.
So, since those two things kind of checked out, everything else, we're going to push that down to the NCDEQ, who, by the way, has an annual budget of $80 million, taking on a pipeline company that made $1 billion between January and September of this year, and is owned by Koch Industries and Shell. So I wonder, in the end, I mean, is Colonial Pipeline afraid of anything the DEQ is going to do for them? Probably not. And so it becomes.
Why would they be? What the fuck? I mean, you said 32 out of the 38 pipeline spills in North Carolina alone they've been responsible for. Clearly, nobody's been, clamoring for them. So of course they're going to continue to. I mean, that's just capitalism, right? They're going to continue to exploit whatever resources that they have if it's printing the money. I mean, $1 billion is. They're going to do it.
Well, see,
unless the government forces them to stop. I mean.
And there's so much more that I reported on in the article, about they've been warned by the government agency PIMSA for just how to say it, that's but they've been fined and or warned by that, especially in cases of checking for inspection records and improperly keeping inspection records, especially when it comes to corrosion tests. They weren't abiding by regulations on that. But of course, in the end, they just get a strongly worded letter and then it gets kicked on down the road. And who knows whatever really becomes of it. I mean, there are documented fines, but they're few and far between. And the thing is that more than 88% of the pipeline that runs through North Carolina, that's 707 miles of pipe that runs through North Carolina, 88% of it is at least 40 years old, right? And you're only checking it. So, all right.
Once every 5 years?
Yeah, you're only checking it once every 5 years, and you're having an incident, what was it? I mean, 20 years, you have 272 incidents in 20 years, and you're only checking it once every 5. I wonder why you're having so many problems.
And do you hear from residents about the way this is affecting their communities? Because I mean, obviously on an abstract level, it sounds horrifying and images obviously are terrifying. But can you give people some context as to the way this is actually affecting people's lives in North Carolina? I'm assuming it's mostly very poor and often Black communities that are most affected by these kind of environmental disasters. Do you think that's the case in this case?
So in this situation, I haven't been able to speak to any on-the-ground residents in the area. Like I live parts north from there. I live around Raleigh, so it's about 3.5 hours away. But from the reporting I have been seeing, people have been affected by this pipeline leak just because it happened on Colonial's land. And that's a big thing. Colonial's making a big deal out of, hey, we didn't contaminate anybody's property. right? But
As if they have the
also,
right to that land in the first place, right? Yeah.
yeah, but they're also just like, hey, we didn't, no harm, no foul. Basically, that seems to be the attitude from Colonial. That seems to be the attitude from the EPA. But Colonial Pipeline has had to buy out at least 3 families out of their homes, not for contamination standpoint, but because of the cleanup is going to take years, and it will take years, and it's also going to be in such a wide radius. The effect in the surrounding area, they've actually had to buy 3 homes or 3 families out of their homes. So like that might not sound like a huge number, right? And it matters.
It's a big deal to those fucking
yeah,
people who lost
and
their home.
and that's the thing that, I'm sure that no matter what Colonial Pipeline paid them for their home, it wasn't worth the time that they've spent in it. And this actually is affecting real people. But I feel like this story, as bad as it is, in my opinion, Colonial Pipeline needs, to be brought before Congress to be investigated. Like honestly, we need a top to bottom audit of Colonial Pipeline as a company, as a whole, to see how are they really inspecting their pipeline. Because it's if this is really the standard that's set, not only is that completely, just subpar and unacceptable, and we need complete overhaul regulatory reform, because the fact of the matter is that in a perfect world, I would say no pipelines, right? Yeah. In a realistic world, I would say no new pipelines, but I would also go further and say that the existing pipelines need to be checked in their entirety every single year, or at least at the bare minimum, at the maximum every 2 years. And those inspection records need to be detailed, and they need to be kept in a public space so everybody can view them. And, they need to be accounted for. When they don't do what they're supposed to do, they need to be hit with actual fines that actually matter. But see, these guys know that they don't have to fear regulators.
Well, they already bought
because
Congress,
nobody's
right?
going to, nobody's going to shut them down. Because then what are you gonna jack up? You're gonna send gas prices skyrocketing to $8 a gallon all up the Eastern Seaboard if you shut down Colonial Pipeline, and they know that, right? The Kochs know that, and that's why they can afford to spend $6.5 million trying to get Tom Tillis elected and succeed. So when things like this happen, the deck is stacked against. But to circle all the way back around to what we talked about right when I got here. Mm-hmm. As bad as the Colonial Pipeline spill is, and as long as it's going to take to clean up, and as big as the conversation needs to be about how Colonial needs to be investigated from top to bottom, but also we need completely new standards for regulation of these aging, decrepit pipelines that we have littered all over the country. Because if what happened in North Carolina were to have happened in the San Francisco Bay yesterday or the day before, just imagine if that's what 600 gallons looks like. Just imagine 1.2. And until some kind of pressure is put on Colonial Pipeline and regulators by the public, by the media, by our politicians, by activist groups, until there is enough fuss made about this issue, it's going to happen again and again and again. If Dakota Access Pipeline spilled $1.2 million of fuel, it'd be shut down tomorrow, right? It happens in North Carolina, and just because it didn't happen on tribal land, and just because it didn't happen in a water supply, nobody bats an eyelash at it. But this is what we need to be. This is an important story, right? At least I feel it is. And it's not just because it's happening in my backyard, because this is not only what happened was dangerous
repeatedly,
and Colonial needs to be completely held accountable for it. But my fear is that this happens in a large body of water like the San Francisco Bay, and then then what? Now it's too late because we didn't stop it.
It's another Gulf of Mexico oil leak.
Well, it's exactly. It's indicative of corporate culture, honestly, and the fact that it did happen in a non-populated, extremely area where a lot of attention is paid. The fact that it did happen in rural North Carolina, I think just says so much about how these corporations operate, and the fact that they are able to get away with so much that goes unreported on because the media doesn't hold them to account, and unregulated because they're in the the politicians are in the pocket of these corporations. So I think this story is very important from a lot of perspectives, and just completely separating it from the actual event, I think it's very indicative of a lot of trends that we see, and that more journalists like yourself should be paying attention to. I mean, people should be taking a cue from you to report on this kind of stuff, because it is mind-boggling how little we hear about it, considering how dramatic the actual amount of oil spilled has been, and the effects it will have. So thank you for breaking this down on that piece, and I've included the piece in the description for anyone to check out. Definitely read his article and check out Robbie Yeager's other reporting. You do a great job, and you're truly independent. So thanks so much for
coming on the show. It was a great time chatting with you, and we look forward to following up. I'm sure we'll continue to keep chatting, and just keep doing great work. We love reading and following you.
Yeah, guys, thanks for having me back on. I know it seems rushed. I wish I had more time, but I really appreciate you guys giving me the platform to share this story with your audience, because I do feel like it's important, and like I said, I'm glad you guys helped me.